Welcome to Podcast, the Business of Dentistry podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Podcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories, and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
Well, welcome to the first edition of this occasional podcast series called In the Loop, with me, Nigel Jones, one of the directors of the Practice Plan group of companies. And I'm delighted for our first podcast to be joined by Eddie Crouch. Welcome, Eddie.
Hello, and thank you for asking me.
No, well, I think what I wanted to do was kick off this series with a view of what might be coming up next year that's significant in dentistry, and obviously specifically NHS dentistry, I guess. But to get your views at this very early stage in the series is brilliant. So I'm really grateful to you for giving up the time, Eddie. So perhaps I could just kick off with a very broad question that I'm sure we'll then expand on. But when you look ahead to next year, what are the key events or key milestones that you think we should be looking out for?
Well, I think several key milestones, really. I mean, I think we're way past the honeymoon period with a new government, and we've seen that in various things that we've expected certain timelines for them to hit, and they haven't hit. And much of that has been as a result of what they say is the financial situation that they've inherited. But it's pretty clear, I think, for the new year that extra investment in dentistry is not going to happen in the short term. We're looking at how we can deliver the 700,000 pledge of extra urgent and emergency appointments. It's really disappointing that nothing has happened in this financial year about that, and the promises of new money don't seem to be materializing, and that's fairly reflective. I think we've got other issues about workforce. There was a consultation from the previous government about provisional registration and tying in new graduates to the NHS, and I expect that to move in the new year once the minister has had an opportunity to have a look at that. I think the DDRB process this year has been absolutely awful, and we're actually entering a phase now of giving evidence for the next financial year without even knowing what the uplift is for this financial year. So I sense that from people I've spoken to that they had given the new government a bit of opportunity to see what new things they were going to introduce. But I think that patience is wearing extremely thin. I wouldn't be surprised, for example, in April if we see a significant number of contracts suddenly being handed back again because people have just given up. We need an air of optimism, and sadly at the moment, despite it being the season of goodwill, I can't give any goodwill to any optimism.
Yeah, that very much chimes with my sense of things. You know, going back to the conference in May, and hearing that comment about the cavalry is coming, it is very much taking its time, and it kind of feels like it's being diverted off to the right rather than actually coming towards dentistry to help. There's loads of stuff.
I mean, one of the problems then, of course, Nigel, was that the person making those comments, who I had spent an awful long time actually briefing about the problems with dentistry, come the Monday after the general election, was replaced with someone who had no experience of dentistry. And, you know, when you've had 6 or 7 ministers responsible for dentistry, continuity is something that we absolutely have to have if we are to actually make significant progress.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and that's been so absent for so long, and it's hard to feel confident that you'll get that continuity and that depth of understanding that would make a material difference. I mean, on the list of things that you were talking about to look forward to, as in look ahead to, the DDRB. So where are we at with the expenses uplift?
Well, the BDA was made an offer fairly early after the general election. Once they'd accepted the review body recommendations of a 6% uplift, and for England, they have for many years, previous administrations manipulated the expenses element to actually make it as cost effective as it could for Treasury. And we were presented with a figure for inflation that bore no reality to what dental inflation was currently running at. We went back to them and said, this will not look good from a new government presenting this to people who have had below inflation uplifts of contracts for years and years and years. You're telling them you're accepting a 6% uplift in pay, and you're only prepared to give them something like 4.6% uplift in contract. That won't go down well. And we were told then that they would have to wait for the budget to actually look at allocations of funding. And that gave us some optimism that they were actually, for once, they might go away and actually look at this and review their decision. But here we are. I met Stephen Kinnock on the early week of November. He told me he understood the frustration. The announcement was imminent. He spoke to LDC officials at the early part of December via video link, and again said the same. It's imminent, but his definition of imminent isn't the same as mine.
No, I agree, and your point about giving evidence for the next year when we still haven't had the results of this year, that seems so wrong and so hard to justify. Am I right in thinking that that they've almost set some parameters for the next version of it around expenses, and people seem to be viewing this 2.8% as potential guideline? Is that something to think about, or do you think it's a completely separate point?
I think people may be reading too much into that. And every year when a remit letter goes to the chair of the DDRB, it contains a recommendation from the Secretary of State of what affordability is. And I think for last year, Victoria Atkins sent a letter to the chair and said something around 3% being affordable. But of course, at the end of the day, DDRB recommended 6%. So I'm not so bothered about that, although it's pretty clear that from an affordability point of view, we are in very, very difficult situations. But, when you've had significant, we've had colleagues from the BDA on strike in secondary care who have benefited from that industrial action with significant pay uplifts. And when you've got people in general dental practice that have seen a 30% cut in the last decade, our patience isn't going to be there for people to say, well, the country's in a dire state. You're only going to get 2.8% uplift in pay. When we've got variance in inflation as we are speaking now, post budget inflation is not looking as though it's going to fall below a certain level for quite a while. And dental practices will be thinking about their long-term futures. So for so long, we've cross-subsidized. And that cross-subsidy has got harder and harder with more and more private work actually being delivered. And you saw the results of the NAO report on the recovery plan. We told them at the time, I think the Health Select Committee said, Sean Charwood, when he gave evidence, said it wasn't worthy of a recovery plan name, and the NAO has backed that up. So it's really frustrating when time, in and out of every time we give them advice. Sadly, independent experts afterwards proved that we were right and people were wrong. But going forward, I think one of the things that was gained out of industrial action alongside the BMA was that there was going to be a complete review of the DDRB process. And I hope that starts to happen with earnest. And I've had an email today from Phil Banfield, my counterpoint in the BMA, about how we sit down and start talking about some of these things.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, it doesn't feel like the process is working terribly well for many people. So hopefully there will be a review of that. The running cost point that you're making and dental inflation, that's in part driven by scarcity of workforce. And you mentioned that in your sort of summary of what's coming up. I think the specific point that you mentioned was about tying in graduates. So I'd be interested to know how you think that's going to play out. But then also overseas dentists, because I mean, the NHS long-term workforce plan also doesn't seem to be terribly credible. But even if it was credible, wouldn't be making a difference until the next decade, really. So it's got to be overseas dentists or these kind of tie-ins. But I'm not sure how quickly it's going to have an impact.
Yeah, I think provisional registration will require quite a significant lead-in time from the GDC to actually make sure it's safe and workable. So it's not a short-term solution. It's more of a medium to longer-term solution. I mean, the BDA, for example, are launching a new membership offer for people who are waiting to get onto the register, and we think that that will be really helpful to colleagues who want reliable advice. And it's quite clear that that has got fairly cross-party agreement that people believe we need to expand the workforce, and as more and more people leave to go privately, the volume of patients that they can potentially see is reducing. So workforce calculations have been a finger in the air job for a long while. And I asked recently at the workforce plan of undergraduate expansion, was 40% based on any realistic data and calculation, or was it what was affordable, or was it a finger in the air? And the early stages of that have all been about how we can innovate to actually produce 40% more dentists, because clearly if a new dental school costs, I understand it's between 140 and 160 million to construct a new dental school, none of the funding within it has been allocated for new build. And I asked a simple question: at the 2.8 billion allocated for the workforce increase, how much of that was coming to dentistry? And frighteningly, no one seemed to be able to give me an answer.
That is it's kind of shocking, but also not that surprising. It's
No, it's not.
It feels. I mean, this is what bothers me about the whole workforce issue, and has bothered me for many years, is that it's been a problem that's been years and years and years in the making, and there's not a quick fix for it, and yet that scarcity then drives up the price, which drives up the cost of employing, associate dentists, or even dental nurses and things. And that makes it really hard for NHS practices to compete with private practices. So it's for me, it's possibly the thing that's driving the most change. And if there's no confidence about what the expenses uplift will be, then there must be reducing confidence about how they can actually achieve the activity targets in the absence to attract sufficient workforce. So it seems to me a really big point, this one. I think Jason, I heard him earlier this year saying that he's starting to make some headway on communicating the workforce challenges, but it doesn't feel like they've taken it as seriously as they should have done.
Well, I mean, there was a major event that the GDC hosted in the last few weeks about workforce, and the speakers there were all of the same sort of voice, really. The fundamental thing to actually encourage the workforce, which we've been saying for a long time, is significant contract reform. And we need to speed that up, because I think the long-term future of NHS delivery is a skill mix model. The UDA doesn't allow that to work effectively. And without contract reform, training 40% more hygienists and therapists won't mean any of those will want to work in the NHS. Importing dentists from around the world won't mean that either. They may come for a short period of time and work in the NHS and then leave it. And if you tie a young graduate into the NHS for 5 years in a poor system, the first thing they're going to do at the end of that 5 years is want to get out as quickly as possible. So all of the whole workforce problems are interchanged with having a contract that's fit for purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I still think there's a challenge with the fact that most dentists that go private don't increase their income. They just see fewer patients and spend more time per patient. So actually, the argument that there's enough dentists in the UK, just not enough to work in the NHS, I'm not sure stacks up. but
No,
they're
no, I think
definitely.
we've changed our mind on that. It was a good political point to make on a run up to a general election, but I think the realism of it is we need to know that. And of course, the data that the GDC are collecting on an annual basis now voluntarily from people, but a significant number are contributing to that. And we're just going to another phase. The trend of that will be really, really interesting to analyze in the new year.
Yeah, I agree. I think these kind of issues are very important to really get into the detail on, rather than have some what seems to be a fairly superficial understanding through just simple head count, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that. So, do you think the tying of graduates is likely to happen? Is that got momentum?
We don't know because the consultation was done under the previous administration. I've spoken to people at NHS England who said that a report has actually been compiled from the feedback that they've had, and they've put it on Stephen Kinnock's desk. Stephen Kinnock's probably got an enormous desk with, he's dealing with the whole of primary care with massive problems everywhere. And it doesn't appear that he's actually picked up the report and had a look at it. But I suspect that will be something that they will go for. I mean, we wouldn't be opposed to actually encouraging people to stay in the NHS for a period of time if it came with a quid pro quo that they were actually helping them with the massive amount of debt that they are incurring as undergraduates. And in fact, our Young Dentist Committee or our Students Committee aren't opposed to actually working in the NHS if it's a good system to work in, and there's some offset about the debt at the start of their career. But we haven't heard any detail for that.
Yeah, no, I agree on both of those points. So that's two or three times you've now referenced contract reform and its importance to making everything hang together. So I think you said in your introductory comments that there might be a package of tweaks, but is that into the same sort of fine-tuning category rather than anything significant or major?
Well, I think we've seen in Scotland and in Wales where significant contract negotiations have taken place in the last few years, that these things don't happen very, very quickly. They happen over a long period of time. So I would suspect, and we don't know even, for example, whether the new patient premium and various other things that came with the recovery plan are going to be extended past the 31st of March. There's been no announcement on that. We've actually lobbied that should continue, and that might be a good way forward as a small start. But it needs far more than that, as the NAO reported. The number of new patients isn't anywhere near what the original plan was intended to provide for. And in Wales, for example, where they have seen a significant number of new patients, it's come at the expense of not being able to recall patients that you should be recalling based on their risk. And you've got to balance all of these things up. But I think contract reform, I would hope, and we're at a turning point for the BDA because Sean Charwood has reached the end of his term of service as chair of the GDPC, and there will be a new chair taking those negotiations forward. But we are hopeful that, by the summer of next year, we are into the meat of discussing, significant changes to the existing contracts.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think, we had the Darzi report that was supposed to be the diagnosis, and then we're supposed to get the 10-year plan in the spring, which is the treatment plan for Darzi's diagnosis. But from what you're saying, we can almost disconnect dentistry from that, because the real discussions will start in the summer then?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. The dentistry has been a massive feature. I every week I meet tens of MPs because it was such an issue during the general election campaign. And, we've had two health select committee reports. We've had the most recent only a few months ago, really, in real terms. And, we said at the time that was the handbook or the roadmap to actually save NHS dentistry. We don't need more and more consultation about what's needed. There's plenty of evidence out there. Health Watch, the Nuffield Trust, everyone's looked at it and said, we need something new. And there are loads of ideas within all of those reports. I can't see a 10-year plan suddenly developing new ideas for dentistry that haven't been thought about before, unless we do what the Nuffield Trust intimated in their report about targeting the service in a way. And whether that's going to be more politically acceptable, with a pan-party, I've heard debates in Westminster Hall recently where MPs from the southwest of England have said, or the east of England have said, we need to focus on urgent and emergency care. And if that was a pan-party objective, we will end up with an NHS that's not all encompassing. But if that is the direction of the travel after the 10-year review, then that would be a major difference to what we've talked about previously.
So it sounds to me, Eddie, if I was to put money on it, that nothing fundamental will change this coming year in 2025. But there's an outside chance that something very fundamental could happen in the line of what you've just been saying.
Yeah, I mean, even with the contract negotiations in Wales that have concluded now, they won't be introducing a new contract in Wales in 25. It'll be 26 because they want to do public consultation and various other things about some of the ideas that they've got for that contract. So, we are talking, and the language that Stephen Kinnock is using in written answers is there is no perfect way of paying dentists. Those are the answers he repeats repeatedly to MPs that send him in written questions. And that is probably true. There isn't a perfect way. But what we can say is there's a much better way of doing it than paying them with UDAs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that as a closing comment, that's probably a good place to end this brief chat, Eddie. But thank you very much. As interesting as ever and insightful as ever. So really appreciate your time for this first in this podcast series. Thank you, Eddie.
Yeah, that's fine. And I just wish everyone who is listening, hopefully, a better 25 than it has been in 24, because it's been incredibly difficult for everyone.
Yeah, completely agree. Many thanks.